The wind came like a file across metal, rasping grit along the hulks in the repair park east of Kharkiv. It found every seam in the canvas shelters, and every cigarette paper between the fingers of men waiting for something, anything, to make a little sense. A corporal at the gate waved in a stuttering shape with a sound that was not quite a knock, not quite a cough, more like a tired animal clearing its throat. It wasn't German. It was small, square-shouldered, and the colour of dry bread. The hood was roped down with a length of commo wire, and the front grille wore mud like a mask. On the passenger seat, a field jacket had been folded into a cradle, and a young signals runner clutched it to his stomach as if it were a ritual, not a tourniquet. Behind the wheel, a driver with frost on his eyebrows kept his foot feathered, begging the engine not to choose this moment to die. The little truck answered in a string of offbeat notes, as though the cylinders were taking turns remembering their job. Across the yard, the master mechanic straightened up from a half-track differential, rolling his shoulders to undo the hour's work. He had a face like a workbench, scored and useful. He watched the gate long enough to understand that the odd arrival was not going to stop under its own pride, then jerked his chin, and men peeled away from their jobs. They caught the front bumper as the driver let the clutch fall out from under him, and the engine sighed into silence. Someone muttered the inevitable question, "How is this thing still moving?" It had limped over 20 kilometers of hard ruts and frozen puddles, with an ignition that should have quit, a radiator that had been hemorrhaging since the second village, and a passenger who needed to be at the casualty station an hour ago. It had dragged itself into the park as if the war wasn't a set of rules but a dare. The runner was carried off by two drivers who had spent half the winter inventing sledges out of fence gates. Both of them patted the tiny truck as they passed, as if it were a mule that had brought them home. The master mechanic went to one knee and reached up into the engine bay without ceremony. His glove came away damp, smelling of antifreeze, oil, and something faintly sweet that the cold had turned brittle. There are machines that announce their purpose with polish, and there are machines that make their purpose obvious by refusing to die. This one was the latter. It wasn't tall enough to look intimidating. It wasn't heavy enough to seem safe. There were no polished edges, no grand hood ornament, no clever German cadences to the design language. It was a box with wheels, a little ladder frame with a beating heart and bones that hinted at more strength than the body suggested. The mechanic put his palm flat on the radiator and felt the heat thrumming up through the cap. He looked at the stamped grille and the little blackout lights and the tool rack bolted to the side shovel and axe like a soldier's kit laid out for inspection. He looked at the stamped steel wheels and the tires that wore their mud like old boots, and the windshield that had been folded flat and tied down with the kind of knot one learns when time is short. "On the bench," he said, meaning the diagnosis bay that was in fact a pair of sawhorses and a table taken from a schoolhouse. But the order carried a charge. Men who had seen everything that a winter campaign could bend, break, or bury were unexpectedly alert. They wanted to see what made this thing tick, and why it had not run out of courage when everyone agreed it ought to have done so. The driver, still sitting behind the wheel as if he respected the seat too much to leave it abruptly, wiped a sleeve across his mouth and whispered something that might have been a prayer or a curse or both. He called the little truck a friend, not in the way men call their rifles by pet names to keep fear at bay, but as if a friendship could indeed be forged with iron and gasoline. On the bench, the hood was swung up and held with a stick. The mechanic's hands went to work as if the machine had asked politely. Pliers on the hose clamp, a twist, a drain, wrench on the plug, one turn, two, distributor cap off with a click, a wipe with a rag. The men watched not because any of this was unusual, but because the usual was happening so smoothly. The bolts weren't fighting the wrench. The fasteners were obvious, accessible, honest. There was a sense that the whole machine had been built to be read in the field by someone who could not afford to misunderstand it. The mechanic felt for compression with an old trick of listening rather than measuring, his ear close to the block as the driver thumbed the starter for a second or two. He nodded, already building a list in his head. Remove and clean the plugs, retime the ignition, patch the radiator neck, set the idle a touch rich to survive the afternoon cold. It occurs, at moments like this, that engineering has moods. There is the mood of elegance, the mood of force, the mood of complexity as a kind of bragging, and then there is the mood of humility, a quiet geometry whose purpose is to go and keep going, even when lied to by bad fuel, bad roads, and bad decisions. The little truck wore that last mood in every line. Its axles spoke the language of live loads and forgiveness. Its transfer case promised options not just for the parade ground, but for the places where roads are rumours. Its leaf springs carried the history of carts and simple suspensions across centuries, not because no one knew better, but because sometimes the oldest answer is the least fragile. The master mechanic wiped his hands and looked around at his men, noting in the eyes of each a dawning curiosity that had nothing to do with propaganda and everything to do with the stubborn fact in front of them. He asked where it had come from, and the driver told the short story of a night run across fields, crushed into ice by a regiment's boots, a wooden bridge that had shrugged at weight but not at speed, a ditch that had pretended to be shallow until it became a test, and a string of postmarkers that kept the route honest. The runner's blood had warmed the seat, the engine's heat had warmed their hands, the steering had answered like an animal trying to please. When the driver's voice trailed off, the silence said the rest. The mechanic closed the hood gently. He did not bless the machine, because machines do not respond to blessings. He gave it something better. A plan. 15 minutes for spark and air, 20 for the leak, 10 for the test drive around the perimeter and over the training ditch, back in time to scrounge a length of hose and an extra belt from the pile of oddments on the shelf marked with chalk as foreign. By nightfall, he decided, it would be good for another day's work. The men nodded because they understood that a promise like that is a form of respect, but he could not quite leave it at that. He had rebuilt engines that were symphonies of machining and brittle pride. He had sworn at vehicles whose genius lay buried under the kind of complexity that looks beautiful in a drawing and hateful in a snowstorm. This little square-shouldered thing was different. It was proud of being easy. It wanted to be understood. When he looked at it, he did not see a trophy or a curiosity. He saw a tool that had learned how to be useful in the most honest way a tool can, by showing up when it is asked, by forgiving mistakes, by making the men who used it a little braver than they had any right to be. He signaled for the driver to take a breath and step away, watched the young man's legs remember how to stand on ground that wasn't vibrating, and then slid behind the wheel himself. The seat accepted his weight like a shrug. The pedal box admitted his boots without complaint. The gear lever sat exactly where a tired hand would reach for it. He thumbed the starter and felt the engine choose, after a single uncertain beat, to live. He eased it forward and around the yard, feeling the steering speak through the column. When he brought it back, his face had acquired a small, reluctant smile normally reserved for jokes told long after lights out. He let the idle stumble and catch, and then he said the thing he did not plan to say. "It wants to work," he murmured, as if sharing a secret with the men and the cold and the war itself. "So we'll let it." The radiator hissed in quiet agreement. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a gun rolled its shoulders and thundered. The little truck sat, willing and unafraid, as the mechanic began to choose the words he would write later that night in his maintenance log. He would not mention sentiment. He would not describe how a machine can seem to keep a promise. He would write down the technical, because armies are made of paper as much as fuel. But the first line he drafted in his mind carried the mood that had settled on the yard. This vehicle arrived in poor condition and under its own power. That was the whole story, and it was the beginning of another. By the time the runner's stretcher came back past the park on its way to the station behind the freight sheds, the little truck had a new length of hose, cleaner spark, and a wash of fresh water across its face where the radiator had spat old coolant like bad memories. The driver paused, one hand on the stretcher rail, and lifted his chin toward the machine that had carried him. A man saluting another man would have looked more formal and less sincere. The master mechanic saw the gesture and filed it away with the rest of the day's evidence. A machine that could make men feel that way had earned more than a glance. It had earned an examination. The light thinned toward evening, hard and blue as a blade. In that winter color, The little truck's flat panels and stamped ribs looked plain to the point of austerity, and yet something about the proportions suggested a rightness that was not concerned with beauty. It was not beautiful. It was truthful. The mechanic set his palm on the fender once more and felt the heat that meant purpose. Tomorrow, he decided, they would strip it properly and learn why it kept its word. Tonight, they would let it rest where the air smelled of cold iron and distant pine, and pretend, just for a minute, that some things in this world were designed to be simple for a reason. He turned away at last, and the men followed, the way soldiers do when they have seen something they cannot yet explain but will not forget. The yard settled back into its rhythm, wrenches tapping, steam ghosting from breath and radiator caps, voices low. The little truck stood where they left it, square and attentive, the kind of silence that looks forward to morning. And morning would come, with questions. The first would be the obvious one. What exactly is this machine the men had started to call, without permission, a friend? It is easy to mistake a legend for a mystery. Rumor supplies the magic, repetition supplies the polish, and before long a straightforward thing wears a veil it never asked for. Strip that away, and what remains is something better than myth. A design that explains itself in clear sentences. The little 1/4 ton 4x4 reconnaissance truck that has slipped into workshops up and down the front is nothing more and nothing less than a compact answer to a hard question. How do you give a soldier wheels that behave like a companion rather than a burden? Begin at the bottom, because that is where a machine declares its loyalties. The frame is a ladder, not a sculpture. 2 parallel rails with cross members that make strength from simplicity. No deep secret lives there. Only straight pieces joined in a way that forgives bad landings and crude repairs. On that ladder sit leaf springs, yes, the old style, stacked steel that has served carts and carriages since before gasoline learned to burn in anger. Each spring is more than memory. It is a pact with weight and motion that says, I will bend and I will not break if you do not ask me to pretend I am delicate. The axles are live, shafts sending torque to wheels without shame about who they are. They are not sophisticated, they are present. Presence is a virtue in mud. Between those axles and the engine lives the transfer case, the little gearbox that grants the driver choices. High range for roads, low range for places the map forgot to name, and a lever that couples the front axle when the earth itself seems to prefer you somewhere else. To a certain kind of engineer, the transfer case is the difference between theatre and work. It is a quiet organ of refusal, insisting that momentum is a right that can be defended by gearing when friction says otherwise. It asks no gratitude. It asks only for oil. The heart is an L-head 4-cylinder, a flathead that does not chase numbers but pursues character. Displacement sits where you expect it to, a little more than 2 liters worth of swept volume, with valves riding beside the cylinders rather than above them. It is not an arrangement that wins bragging rights in cafes. It is an arrangement that warms quickly, tolerates mediocre fuel, welcomes field timing by twine and eye, and starts after a night that could snap a better pedigree in 2. The carburetor is no trickster. It will sit on a bench, open in a soldier's hands, and accept a cleaning from a rag and a toothpick. The distributor cap removes with a pair of clips that were designed not to fly into the snow and disappear forever. The spark plugs will accept a socket that can be stolen from almost any other part of the machine. When a soldier says, I can fix this, what he means is not that he owns a miracle. He means that the designers respected his time. Stand back a step and look at the shape. The body is a box, because a box holds things without argument. Seats are pads over stamped pans. The windshield folds because windshields do not deserve to have the last word when height meets branches or bullets. There are brackets for tools, not because someone thought it would be charming, but because an axe and a shovel turn a stuck vehicle into one that is going somewhere again. Under the seats, little cubbies hide spares and odds. A coil of wire, a plug, a clamp, a wrench that looks like it has seen 100 arguments and won most of them. The fuel tank lives under the driver, where it can be protected by the machine that carries it rather than by a theory. The filler neck peeks out like a practical joke, surprising the first time, Never again. If you want elegance, look at the way the steering speaks through the column. Not too slow, not too eager. An honest gear ratio that lets tired hands keep a line across ploughed fields without a wrestling match. The brakes are drums all around. They have nothing to prove except that they will still be there at the third village and the fifth. The clutch is the kind of pedal you can feel with boots numb from standing guard. It tells you with pressure and release that it means to serve, not to instruct. Lights hide behind blackout masks because nighttime belongs to shapes that see without being seen. A small switch, purposeful, throws the system into that mode as quietly as a man removing his boots outside a sleeping tent. The electricals, modest as a farmer's list, run on a voltage that has learned not to make life complicated. The battery can be coaxed, swapped, convinced. Wire runs are not art. They are lines drawn by someone who has been cold and in a hurry and wants the next cold, hurried man to understand what he is looking at. It is fashionable in better dining rooms to assume that excellence requires difficulty. This little machine pushes back against that idea at every joint. The dashboard does not issue challenges. It offers what a driver needs to know without pretense. Oil pressure? Here. Water temperature? Here. Ammeter? Of course, so you can see the story the generator is telling. A hand throttle and choke invite you to treat the engine like an animal that can be soothed with a touch, rather than a machine that punishes any deviation from ritual. Climb in wearing ammunition pouches and a greatcoat, and you will discover a cabin that understands you are a human being first, and a measurement later. Knees have room because the steering wheel is large enough to offer leverage without demanding contortions. The floor is steel that does not mind boots. The glove box is a tin laugh that nevertheless holds a map case tight against rattles. The canvas top is a suggestion more than a wall. Rain will find its way in, but cold wind has to work for the privilege. None of this is luxury. All of it is respect. A word on philosophy, because the parts add up to more than themselves when they are arranged with an ethic. The ethic here is serviceability. In wartime, serviceability becomes a kind of morality. A machine that can be understood quickly and maintained lazily, but well not from contempt, but from necessity, earns a place at the front of the line. It is not that the truck is primitive. It is that every place where complexity might have been invited to the party, the designers asked what the invitation would cost when the party moved to a ditch at midnight. So you find straight lines where curves could have been handsome, bolts where rivets might have flattered, steel stampings where castings would have fought back against dents. None of this would matter if the machine refused the road. But this box on wheels makes friends with terrain. With low range engaged, it climbs not because it is athletic, but because it is patient. With tire pressures lowered by a careful driver and a pocket gauge, it floats on mud in a way that feels like grace learned from experience. It will ford water as high as its bravery allows, so long as the driver remembers where the intake draws breath. It will cross a ditch sideways, trying not to betray its balance, because the weight sits low and the track is wide enough to argue with foolish angles. It will accept a tow rope with the dignity of a creature that has both given and received help. When a workshop crew meets such a vehicle, the introductions go fast. Names are exchanged, part numbers and socket sizes, and then everyone gets on with it. The bolts that hold the belly pan are where you expect them to be. The grease fittings announce themselves because neglect is a form of cruelty, and this machine does not deserve it. A universal joint will complain with the exact noise that tells you what it is, not with some elaborate riddle. And that, in the end, is what a Jeep actually is, an object that refuses to make things difficult. You could stand here and chant figures, displacement, horsepower in the 60s, torque modest but loyal, weight under a metric ton, naked and a little more when burdened, wheelbase a whisper over 2 meters, clearance that keeps the belly off the stones, a speed on roads that is brisk enough to keep appointments with artillery, liaison officers, and those figures would be true and useful. But the soul of the thing is a sentence spoken plainly. I am built so that a tired soldier can keep me alive with tools and understanding instead of luck. The master mechanic admired such sentences. He liked that the hood opened not as a ceremony but as a handshake. He liked that the spark could be persuaded to return with a rag and patience. He liked that in this machine, human intention travelled through steel with almost no distortion. He had known machines that demanded perfect conditions and offered perfect results when they were met. This one embraced imperfect conditions and offered results that were good enough, often enough, to change outcomes. Simplicity, he thought, is not the absence of thought. It is thought spent in advance so that someone else does not have to spend it later, under fire. When he closed the hood, the sound it made was a punctuation mark at the end of that sentence. The yard breathed, and he found himself thinking not of myths, but of the next day's work and the next week's roads. If this is what the machine is, he decided, then the numbers that anchor the story can be stated as calmly as facts in a ledger, and the men who read them will know why they matter. And having stated them, there will still be the question that presses at the edges of curiosity. How did such machines, born under a different flag, find their way into the hands that now intend to understand and use them? Numbers have a way of making the air steadier. They don't banish cold, or quiet artillery, or keep a night from lasting a little too long, but they turn wonder into comprehension. So here, without the posture of a parade or the drama of rumour, are the facts that hold this little machine up like tent poles in wind. It weighs, empty, in the neighbourhood of a half-ton, and change more by the time you add fuel, crew, a radio set if you're lucky enough to rate one, and the small empire of tools and rations that every driver accumulates. That mass is not a boast. It is a deliberate choice to keep momentum manageable and rescues feasible. With 2 men and a third to direct, you can press a stuck wheel out of a rut. With 4, you can sneak the nose around a tree that had no business blocking a lane. Weight here is not an anchor. It is an amount of problem you can lift with friends. Under the hood, the 4-cylinder offers horsepower that reads modestly on a page and feels bigger on a hill. 60, give or take, depending on tune and dignity. But the charm isn't the peak. It's the way the torque arrives like an old friend who doesn't need to announce himself. Low down in the revs, the pull is enough to climb out of a bad decision if the surface will grant you a little friction. In low range, that pull becomes patience, translated through gear teeth into movement. You don't conquer a field with this engine. You befriend it until it shares. The wheelbase sits a hair over 2 meters, just enough to bridge small ditches without hanging a belly on the edge. The track is wide enough to keep foolishness from turning into a roll at the first provocation, narrow enough to slip between trees that were planted by someone who never imagined a vehicle would attempt such a corridor. Ground clearance matters in every conversation with a rock, a stump, or the frozen shoulders of a rut, and here the numbers are kind, giving the truck a way to ignore insults that would catch a lower machine in the ribs. Top speed is a figure men recite when they are young and a little bored. The machine will do 60 kilometers per hour and more on a decent bit of road with air and luck. But the truer number is the one the driver carries in his wrists, the speed at which the truck remains part of the earth instead of an argument with it. That number lives somewhere south of reckless and north of plodding, and it keeps appointments more reliably than a boast. Range, on a full tank, depends on the honesty of the route and the generosity of the throttle. On roads, you can plan a day's errands without sweating a jerrycan. Off-road, the machine consumes fuel the way men consume stories more quickly when the going is rough, less when caution walks in front with a stick. Fording depth is not a trick. It is a boundary. The intake breathes from a height that teaches humility near streams. A careful driver will watch the bow wave like a language, will keep the speed just enough to maintain a moving hump of water that protects the bay from a gulp, will resist the urge to hurry. Many machines can cross water. This one distributes that skill not to the lucky, but to the attentive. The tire size, a number stamped on rubber that becomes a habit after a month, is chosen not for prettiness but for an agreement between grip and sidewall honesty. Air them down, and the footprint grows like a friendly boot. Air them up, and the road hum becomes bearable. Spares, because fate takes notes, ride on the rear with a confidence that suggests they expect to be asked to serve. They usually are, in time. Payload is a word experimented upon in bars and in staff meetings. In practice, This little truck carries 4 men who do not care about comfort in the abstract but very much care about arriving alive. It will carry a wounded comrade sideways across the rear, his boots overhanging like a prayer. It will accept ammunition cans until the springs frown, which is later than one might think. It will tow a light piece with a humility that makes drivers of larger machines blush. It will carry radios, maps, the weight of an officer's decisions, and the kind of silence that settles when a patrol returns at dawn. Electricals hum along at a voltage that is not a burden, feeding lamps, horn, ignition, and any small luxuries Newton and Faraday can lend to men in fields the glow of a dial, the courtesy of a starter, the click of a relay. In cold, the system still finds spark if the driver knows the ritual. A breath of choke, a whisper of throttle, the patience to let oil find corners before load is asked. The generator earns its keep without drama, topping the battery when road speed gives it the chance, tolerating idles longer than it prefers. Maintenance hours per 100 kilometers are the statistic that mechanics respect more than any campaign ribbon. On this machine, the figure is forgiving. Grease where it asks. Check what it tells you with sight glasses and dipsticks. Listen for the stories bearings tell when they begin to forget their youth. A driver who continues to treat it as a partner rather than a mule discovers that the truck will forgive even lapses that would doom more sensitive designs. Against these numbers, the question inevitably arises: how does it compare to the familiar light cars that already populate motor pools? The answer is not a duel of velocities. It is a difference of jobs. A light car is an obedient clerk. This little truck is a field hand you would trust to fetch you out of a bad field in weather that does not love you. The clerk will carry papers and officers with dignity across roads that are roads. The field hand will carry the wounded and messages and decisions across that which is not a road at all, and will do it in a voice that says, simply, "I will try." There are men who will turn these facts into a hymn. There are men who will set them down in neat lines and expect arguments to go quiet. Neither is quite right. The facts form the scaffolding, but the building is erected by use. That is why the spec sheet is only half the gift. The other half is the way those numbers behave in this war, in this winter, under these hands. And that other half answers the next sensible question without sentiment. How did machines like this find their way into workshops that were never meant to receive them, into fingers that had learned on different wrenches, under flags that once faced them across fields? They arrived the way useful things arrive in wartime, by improper routes and honest need. Some were scooped from the edges of battles that had the courtesy to leave more than smoke behind. Some were inherited from allies turned adversaries by the strange arithmetic of surrender. Papers signed in rooms that smelled of damp wool and burned coffee, columns handed over with the wear already written into their tires. Some were traded in the shadow economy that sprouted wherever front lines wavered and supply chains kinked gasoline for chocolate, a battery for a coat, a running vehicle for a promise the trader hoped to keep. On the Eastern Front, they sometimes appeared like artifacts of another climate, their proportions so alien to the familiar silhouettes that drivers gawped before they remembered to covet. A patrol would return with muddy faces and a tale of a farm track that had given up a little truck hiding in a barn, its engines still warm enough to accuse the world of bad timing. In North Africa, the sun bleached away the paint until the trucks wore a universal color that didn't care which army owned it. There, a capture often began with a sprint, both sides wanting the machine not because it was a trophy, but because it was a way to carry water, wounded, maps, and men across distances that felt like deliberate insults. Officialdom tried to keep up with the facts on the ground. The Wehrmacht had a numbering habit for captured vehicles that sorted them into categories and gave them names in a system that made the paperwork exhale with relief. Labels were assigned, designations created, manuals whispered into being by men who saw early that war loves a machine that shrugs at language. But the truth lived lower than the registry. It lived in the workshops and the motor pools and the field parks, where a machine either made itself welcome or proved too exotic to feed. When one of these little trucks came in, the first conversation was not theological, it was practical. Could it be made to serve without demanding a throne of spare parts that did not exist? The answer, more often than not, was yes, astonishingly. Yes, because the very simplicity that defined the machine's character also made it a citizen of any workshop where a man could read a thread pitch with his fingertips. Bolts could be matched from bins that had never met an American factory. Hoses could be cut from coils meant for other things. Belts could be persuaded to length with a little cleverness and a prayer to friction. Only certain items, the peculiar distributor, the carburetor, some seals insisted on their birthplaces. Even then, cannibalization began to write its own logistics, and one dead truck made 3 live ones when the mood in the yard was stubborn and generous. How they were assigned after capture followed a logic that made sense to men whose workdays were measured in kilometers, not salaries. Reconnaissance units were quick to adopt them because speed over bad ground is a currency that pays with interest. Artillery liaison officers blessed them because a little truck that arrived on time with an updated firing order might be the difference between a battery that guessed and a battery that ended the afternoon cleanly. Engineers liked them for their willingness to become platforms for odd jobs, stretchers on planks, cable reels built from crates, ladders, tools, and the kind of improvisations that turn a vehicle into a member of a team. The officers in charge of such allocations were not fools. They had seen captured equipment bring more trouble than it was worth, engines that drank an octane no one had, gearboxes that sulked when asked to play by the rules of another doctrine, tires that demanded a size as rare as mercy. But these little trucks slipped past suspicion. They asked only for fuel that was good enough and the courtesy of regular grease. They did not require the motor pool to learn a new religion. They needed instead time on a ramp and the rough friendship that mechanics extend to anything that earns it. Sourcing fuel and spares for machines born elsewhere always involves compromise. Fuel, at least, is a thing the war made plenty of, even if its quality wobbled. The trucks tolerated that wobble. Spares were more of a conversation. Where official channels failed, the unofficial stepped in with a fluency that makes staffs nervous and wars survivable. Drivers traded notes. This depot had a crate of filters mislabeled as stove parts. That unit's captured pile included 3 with decent axles and rotten frames, a treasure in disguise. A man with a knack for languages found that the language of part numbers was easier than he expected. A man with a knack for barter discovered that the world is full of people willing to swap a coil for coffee. There were, of course, moments when the whole project seemed ridiculous. An order would come down forbidding the use of captured vehicles in this or that role, and men would nod because nodding is a currency too. The order would become a piece of paper, the paper would go into a file, and the file would be overtaken by events. A stretcher fits across that rear deck whether or not a regulation has made peace with the fact. A radio finds power whether or not a form has been updated. A patrol needs a return ride whether or not the clerk can find the correct designation in his book. In a war of improvisation and endurance, a machine that could carry a man and his tools across ground that hated them became a small rebellion against bureaucracy's habit of arriving late. A memory of one such arrival survived in the master mechanic's yard. The little truck that had limped in with a wounded runner returned the next day from the casualty station empty and upright, a bandage of new hose bright against the old engine's darkness. It was sent on a liaison run, then on another. At the end of the week, someone hung a length of rope under the seat and tied a short plank across the rear so that a stretcher could ride steady. No one asked permission. Everyone understood necessity. That is how such machines took root, not with speeches or plans, but with small acts of respect for what worked. From farther west, tales came of columns in France where the roads were littered with vehicles in every paint scheme war can invent, and the line between friend and former friend blurred at the margins of usefulness. In those stories, these little trucks passed between hands like a rumor that turned out to be true. When they wore new markings, the paint often stopped at the edges of practicality. The rest was left to mud and time. A driver would wipe away the dust and discover under his own symbol the ghost of another, then shrug and drive on. He did not think of symbolism. He thought of getting the map and the man next to him where they needed to be before dusk. By the season's turn, enough of these vehicles had proven their manners that even cautious motor sergeants kept an eye out for them. A capture list would cross a desk, and somewhere a pencil would pause over the line that mattered most: condition. If it ran, it was wanted. If it didn't, it might be made to. The allocation would follow. The logbooks would learn a new name in the corner of their pages, and the workshops would add a crate labelled "In Chalk and Hope" for the little ones. The master mechanic, who distrusted romance in professional matters, noticed something he rarely saw with equipment that wore the enemy's past. Men argued to keep these. They defended them with evidence. They returned them to service with a speed that suggested pride. He understood then that adoption does not happen on paper. It happens in the hours when a machine makes a day kinder to the people who have to live it. That is how they arrived. Not as invaders or as curiosities to be paraded around a depot. They arrived the way allies arrive in the better stories, at the moment when help is needed and without requiring a speech. They were folded into routines and redeployed where they made a difference. And because wars have a sense of humor, they sometimes carried back into battle the men who had once faced machines like them from the far side of a field. The irony did not matter, the utility did. And in motor parks from the steppe to the hedgerows, men who valued function over pedigree learned a simple truth that made logistics officers sigh and drivers grin. If a machine wants to work, you make room for it. Morning brought the kind of cold that makes metal ring brighter. The yard woke to breath plumes and the scrape of boots, and the little truck stood where it had slept, squared to the day like a man at parade. The evaluation began, the way all honest work begins, with a routine that looks simple until you have to perform it under time. Intake first. A conversation between the machine and the logbook. The master mechanic took the clipboard from the corporal and wrote the only words that matter before numbers complicate things. Arrived under power, cooling fault, ignition, weak, drive line quiet, steering steady. Those few lines turned curiosity into responsibility. Fluids followed, because fluids tell the truth even when men don't. Oil came out with the colour of hard miles and the grit that announces neglect rather than catastrophe. The filter surrendered a story of dust and a winter's worth of short runs. Coolant drained in a tired sigh, and the cracked neck of the radiator asked not for pity, but for a sleeve and a better clamp. Fuel smelled serviceable. The carbs bowl held a sediment that looked like the inside of a barn roof. Nothing here required a miracle, it required hands. Compression was checked with a method older than gauges, a thumb and an ear, and a starter tapped in brief, polite bursts. The master mechanic felt the push back, cylinder by cylinder, and nodded to himself. He paired a plugs gap with a file in 2 quick strokes, reset the point gap by feel, and made a note to clean the distributor cam later when time forgave distractions. Belts were inspected, not for perfection but for honesty. A fraying edge earned a twist of wire and a promise of replacement when scrap yielded something close enough. Hoses were cinched with clamps that bit evenly at last. Underneath, the belly told its own story. The skid plate wore scrapes in a pattern that made sense for someone who had learned to keep momentum where geometry refused easy passage. Drips were mapped to sources, not blamed on weather. U-joints took grease with the relief of joints set right after a week of limp steps. The transfer case lever threw cleanly across its arc. The front prop shaft slept at an angle that suggested sound bearings. Each of these small confirmations accumulated in the mechanic's head like coins in a pocket. Enough of them, and a day turns from problem to work. Electrical checks came next, because spark is morale. The battery thought about giving up, reconsidered, then delivered. The generator cut in where it should. The amateur answered with a needle that believed in cause and effect. The loom was traced with the eye of someone who has seen midnight smoke and doesn't wish to see it again. Chafes were wrapped. Grounds were rethought. A fresh fuse replaced a bit of wire someone had persuaded into service far from supervision. The headlamps blinked awake, as if surprised to be consulted in daylight. Then came the shakedown, the proving lap that decides whether a machine is a guest or a resident. The course ran the perimeter of the park and dipped through a training ditch that had humbled better pedigrees. The mechanic took the wheel and pointed the nose at the corner where ruts bit deep and frozen ridges tried to twist the chassis into an argument with itself. Low range engaged with a small, confident click. The little truck eased forward without complaint, steering light but not vague, suspension talking but not pleading. Over the ditch and up the opposite bank, the throttle asked for patience rather than heroics, and was given it. At the top, the mechanic paused and listened. Good machines have a sound at rest that resembles a calm breath. He heard it and smiled. The playbook's last pages belonged to allocation. You do not waste a tool that wants to work. The sergeant from reconnaissance arrived with the eagerness of a man who already knew where he would send it. A liaison officer hovered, thinking of map cases and batteries. The master mechanic weighed the claims with the fairness that rises from experience. He wrote a line that settled the argument. To liaison, with stretcher fittings retained, return for inspection at 75 kilometers. He added a second line in smaller writing. Driver to be briefed on winter starting, choke use, tire pressure discipline. Machines earn their reputations. Drivers protect them. By midday, the truck wore a new length of hose that did not match but did its duty, plugs that sparked with conviction, and a patch on the radiator neck that would hold until the next thaw tested it again. It had crossed its ditch twice more to satisfy the curiosity of men who claim not to be sentimental and are. It had found its job for the weak, and jobs, in a war that eats them, are faith. The mechanic closed the clipboard and hung it on its nail. The playbook had been followed, not because ritual pleases anyone, but because ritual is how you make luck of your own. The proper stripping came the next day, after the truck returned from a short run with mud on its sills, and a driver's grin marking a success that paperwork would later describe as routine. The hood rose again, this time not for a quick fix, but for a conversation conducted with wrenches. The master mechanic began where access invited him. That invitation was the first lesson. Fasteners presented their heads like students who had done the assignment. Thread pitches behaved like citizens of a standard that did not change its mind in the night. A hand reaching for a bolt found not a knuckle-splitting recess, but clearance measured in forgiveness rather than pride. Each subassembly came free with the dignity of a system that expects to be understood. The air filter, oil bath type, surrendered its cup of grit and chaff, and asked for a refill like a man asking for coffee. The carburetor, once on the bench, laid itself open under a screwdriver with no allegiance to luxury, and its jets gleamed like small promises that careful cleaning still matters. The distributor cap lifted with two clips that did not ping into oblivion. Beneath, the breaker points confessed their wear calmly. A cloth, a few passes with a file, a light smear of grease on the cam foot, and timing returned like a memory. The cooling circuit taught the second lesson. The path from pump to block to radiator was drawn as if by someone who had watched men freeze and did not wish to see that again. The water found its way without corners that punished scale. The hoses ran where hands could reach them without cursing, and the radiator core, once patched, accepted its role without drama. Flow was not a theory. It was a loop that asked for little and gave heat the dignity of management rather than accident. Underneath, the drivetrain declared its intention to be maintained rather than admired. Drain plugs were placed where a pan could live under them without a juggler's skills. Fill points did not require double elbows. Universal joints spoke the honest language of zerks and cups. The transfer case cover came off without a declaration of war, and inside, the gears wore their work like old soldiers, marked but not maimed, faces polished by use rather than stripped by neglect. The mechanic ran his thumb along a tooth, felt the smoothness that time gives when load is matched to purpose, and nodded. Suspension, the third lesson, made an argument for old solutions. Leaf springs, not glamorous, not fashionable, had been chosen for what they do in the world rather than what they say in the drawing office. Their leaves were well spaced and banded in a way that made dirt a nuisance rather than a sentence. Shackles could be unbolted without inventing new tools. Bump stops sat where they might actually stop a bump. Shock absorbers had fittings that suggested a man, not a god, was expected to replace them. The electrical harness, once unwrapped in a few places, revealed care where corners are usually cut. Wires were routed with an eye for chafe, secured with clips that could be pinched open and reused, labelled in a manner that felt like kindness during rain. Grounds were made of real metal, touching real metal, not paint pretending to be obedience. The fuse block was modest but present. In cold, modest and present are the characteristics most machines forget to cultivate. What surprised the German hands most was not any one genius, but the relentlessness of accommodation. Bolt heads were the same where they could be the same. Clearances were generous where heat or dirt would otherwise betray tight tolerances. Panels came away in the order you hoped they would. The truck behaved like a system designed in daylight for use in the dark. When the mechanic removed the belly pan, he discovered that its bolts, once wire-brushed, fitted again without cross-threading or prayer. When he went to adjust the clutch, the linkage offered an adjuster placed as if a human knee and a human patience had been considered. He had known machines that punished indifference and rewarded devotion with occasional cooperation. This one rewarded attention with momentum. Every minute saved in service was a minute given back to road and mission. He could feel in his own bones how quickly a day's worth of tiny mercies adds up to an hour. How an hour can become a path cleared before dusk, a runner delivered before shock deepens, a battery aligned before a barrage misses its window. By late afternoon, the little truck lay partly opened like a book whose spine had learned to tolerate rereading. The carb parts dried on a rag. The plugs, regapped and honest, waited to return home. Fresh grease shone where dull joints had lived. The belly pan leaned against a wall, showing the map of old scrapes and new belief. The mechanic tightened the last clamp and sat back on his heels, letting blood return to hands that had worked without resentment. He found himself amused by an odd thought, that the machine had been designed not to impress him but to improve his day. He closed it up, started it, and listened. The idle settled on a note just a little faster than before, a gate ready to move at a moment's suggestion. Revved gently, the engine answered without clearing its throat. The mechanic flicked the lights on in the gathering dusk and watched the cones of dimmed glow kiss the ground. He thought of the places still to test, the obstacles still to try, the comparisons still to make for the men who loved debates almost as much as they loved results. There would be trials tomorrow, honest ones, with mud and ice and the kind of slopes that wipe the grin off a driver's face. He looked forward to it, which is not the usual reaction to work. The little truck had done that too. They chose a strip of land behind the rail embankment where training had worn the earth into a catalogue of problems. There was the ditch that taught humility, the rutted climb that separated optimism from traction, the sideways traverse that measured balance more than power, and the shallow ford that punished mistakes with wet boots and laughter that always sounded relieved. The mechanic climbed in with the driver who had brought the truck the first day, and a small crowd followed on foot, hands in pockets, hats low, eager to watch without admitting it. The first pass took the ditch at a slow approach because pride ruins more axles than stones do. In high range, the truck eased down until the front wheels hung for a heartbeat, then rolled into the bottom on its belly pan with a thump that was more announcement than complaint. Low range engaged, the rear wheels bit, and the whole machine flexed and climbed, nose lifting with an expression that could be mistaken for cheer. At the top, the driver breathed out a laugh through his teeth. The mechanic nodded once, making a mark on his private scorecard that meant geometry and clearance trustworthy. The rutted climb came next, a serpentine path of frozen grooves left by heavier vehicles that had carved their impatience into the hill. Here the lesson was throttle discipline. Too much and the wheels polished ice out of dirt. Too little and the momentum that carries light machines vanished. The driver chose a line that avoided the most vicious depressions, feathered the pedal until the engine spoke in a low, confident hum, and let the truck step rather than leap. Twice the left rear slipped. Twice the wheel regained purchase without the sideways lurch that signals a bad minute ahead. At the crest, the crowd's chatter sharpened into something like admiration that they would later call mere observation. Side slope was the test that scares everyone because it disorders a man's inner ear and ego. With the ground falling away to the right, the truck took a path that forced the suspension to choose between stiffness and sympathy. The wide track and low mass did their quiet work. The body leaned, but not abruptly. The springs allowed motion without setting up the oscillation that ends in panic. The driver kept his hands still, and his eyes where he wanted to go, not where fear insisted he look. The machine obeyed the gaze rather than the fear. When they reached level ground again, the mechanic wrote another invisible mark. Center of gravity, acceptable, warning angle, generous, driver education, still the better part of keeping rubber down. They towed a light gun then, because it is one thing to carry yourself, and another to carry responsibility. Hitched at the pintle, the little truck took the weight, like a dog takes a leash from someone it trusts. Starts required a tick more throttle, stops required a longer horizon and a more persuasive foot. The engine did not overheat. The gearbox did not sulk. The hills that had been simply climbs became negotiations, but they were negotiations entered into by a partner who had read his brief. At the top of one grade, the mechanic had the driver stop and idle. Steam remained theoretical. The needle on the temperature gauge stayed where experience learns to call it home. Cold starts were tested again after an hour's rest, when heat had walked out of the block into air that collects engines for the sport of it. The ritual: choke a finger out, throttle a whisper open, starter for 2 heartbeats, pause, another touch. The engine returned as if remembering the reason it had been asked to come in the first place. There are machines that forgive only when flattered. This one forgave because it had been built to forgive. Oil pressure rose like bread in an oven, steadily, reassuringly. A driver from a different unit muttered something approving in a dialect that makes compliments sound like weather reports. Finally, they did the task that matters most and is least theatrical. A stretcher, settled across the rear on the plank that had been added for that purpose, carried a man with a bound arm, while the driver chose a path that valued smoothness over speed. Suspension that had seemed stiff during the side slope softened under the weight, and the truck walked the ground in a way that spared the patient the jolt that turns a bad wound worse. Arriving at the aid station, the mechanic watched the stretcher-bearers lift their man out with movements practiced into tenderness. The driver looked at his machine and patted the fender once, as if acknowledging a colleague's share in the work. Field trials end not with fanfare but with silence. Everyone hears the same sentence without speaking it. That will do. Tools return to pockets, hands find warmth. The mechanic, who rarely wasted praise, allowed himself the luxury of memory. He remembered machines that asked too much in return for their brilliance, and machines that offered nothing even when everything had been done for them. This truck offered enough, often, and asked little. He set the clipboard down on the hood and wrote in the space usually reserved for defects. None serious. Recommend continued service in roles requiring faith. There was, he knew, one more conversation to have before the day could end. Comparison is the human impulse that keeps men honest and arguments lively. The yard already held the shapes that would supply the other half of the sentence. Tomorrow, then, they would line them up nose to nose and let claims make way for evidence. They brought the familiar light car around, the one that looked like a field jacket pressed by a sergeant, neat, low, and committed to Rhodes even when Rhodes tried to deny it. It sat politely beside the little truck, as men gathered with hands stuffed into coat pockets and opinions warming on their tongues. A pair of motorcycles rattled into place, their sidecars carrying spares and swagger. 3 ways to cross bad country stood shoulder to shoulder, and the mechanic felt the yard tilt toward a trial that would settle nothing permanently and everything for the week. The noise always starts with claims. The light car, say its defenders, is more reliable because it is lighter and simpler and does not pretend to be what it is not. It sips fuel with better manners, they add, as if thrift were immoral. It will not roll over and embarrass you when you take a corner with a little hurry in your heart. The motorcycles, their riders insist, go where 4 wheels fear to tread, whisper through trees, drink little, and can be lifted out of trouble by 2 men who did not ask to be giants. They are fast where speed is important, which is everywhere a man tells a story afterward. The mechanic let the talk stand for a moment, because talk is the way men check the sharpness of their own thoughts. Then he raised a hand and pointed at the ground. The tests would be modest, as weather and duty demanded, but they would be real. First, traction across a field whose skin was crusted snow and whose underside hid ankle-deep mud. The light car went first, engine humming with a tone that suggested it would like smoothness in exchange for service. 50 meters out, a diagonal rut mocked its rear wheels, and progress became a ballet of spin and correction. It made the distance with dignity, but not serenity. The motorcycles danced, skittering and then finding purchase, sidecars tugging like small, excitable dogs. They reached the end, with the exhilaration that always follows a successful risk. The little truck, in low range with front axle engaged, walked the same ground as if it had been there yesterday and would be there tomorrow. Not fast, not graceful, certain. Next came clearance, a row of rounded stones and frozen clods set to punish belly and ego. The light car's philosophy of flat undersides and clever geometry paid dividends. It skimmed rather than struck, but twice the hull kissed ice with a hollow note that made drivers wince in sympathy. The motorcycles hopped and thumped, and one rider dabbed a boot and swore himself warmer. The truck rolled its belly pan over the obstacles like a man easing across a rough threshold, the scrape speaking of work done, not damage taken. Its frame flexed a little, and then it forgot the insult. Fuel became the subject men return to when everything else seems close. Here the light car made its best case, because on roads that are roads and routes that stay blessed, it will eat less, and therefore require less from a supply chain already tired of being mocked by winter. But roads that are roads are rarer than talk admits. Off the map, under load, in low range, the little truck drinks more, yes, but writes its own excuses in the ledger by delivering men and messages when frugality would have left them behind. The motorcycles drank least and demanded most of their riders in return. Everyone nodded at the fairness of those equations. Reliability, the myth with the strongest back, needed proof. The light car had its admirers because its simplicity tended to repay care with stoicism. It did not like water in its lungs, but then, few do. It preferred the kind of mud that sits politely rather than grapples. Its fan waistband asked for attention when long grass attempted strangulation. The motorcycles needed constant courtship. Their chains wrote schedules on men's fingers, and their spark sometimes chose romance over punctuality. The truck, in the yard's short acquaintance, had asked for grease, clean spark, and a driver who listened. It forgave lapses more often than it punished them. The most stubborn rumour wears fear like a coat, that the little truck flips at a glance, that its square stance is a liar, that a corner taken with any impatience will send men into a ditch with a story that ends in accusation. The side-slope test the previous day had already argued against that with the quiet emphasis of experience. Now they found a curve on hard ground, and carved it at a pace chosen with care. The light car handled the arc with a grace that comes from a low centre and narrow ambition. The motorcycles leaned and exulted. The truck rounded with a body roll that told truth rather than lies, and its tyres spoke to the driver through the wheel with words that could be understood. No drama, only a reminder that physics keeps score and that drivers who respect that fact get to come home. Comfort, which no one laughs about in private, entered the debate under the disguise of endurance. After an hour of repeated runs, the light car's seats told the same story they always tell, adequate for papers and short trips, less forgiving over ruts fast enough to make a day too long. The motorcycles offered numbness and exhilaration in equal measure. The truck's seats, simple pads over steel pans, surprised by making roughness tolerable when speed had to be kept. You could carry a wounded man across the back of the truck without adding cruelty. That is not a small verdict. By the time the sun swung low, the crowd had performed the ritual that resolves myths into proportions. No one lost face because the truth honoured each machine where it deserved to be honoured. The light car remained what it had always been, an obedient servant on ground that behaves. The motorcycles continued to be the scalpel you reach for when speed and stealth matter more than load. And the little truck earned the word men had been edging toward without wanting to sound sentimental. It was, in spite of its angles and its lack of polish, a friend to those who worked from the map's torn edges inward. When the mechanic wrote the day's conclusions, he did not indulge rhetoric. He set down use cases and maintenance notes and the small decisions that inform allocation. Assign the truck to liaison and medical relay. Permit towing of light pieces with caution on grades. Enforce tire pressure discipline for mud. Educate drivers on low-range etiquette. Schedule grease every other day in this weather. Behind those sentences lived a simpler one that he did not submit to paper because paper does not know what to do with gratitude. The machine did what men asked and forgave them for how they asked it. That is the difference between myth and reality, and the reality was enough. War loves arguments about genius, but the front line keeps the score with uptime. What made this small truck matter was not some occult brilliance. It was the way a factory thought about men it would never meet. You could feel that thought in the parts bin as much as under the hood. Interchangeability wasn't an ideal whispered in boardrooms. It was a habit stamped into metal. Shift workers on one coast pressed fenders that agreed with frames from another, and the agreement held in snow, mud, and the hurried shade of a field park. That discipline turned machines into promises. Bolts matched threads without fuss because gauges had been policed by people who were paid to distrust drift. Holes lined up because jigs were treated like scripture. Drawings were not art that changed with each engineer's mood. They were living contracts with fitters, toolmakers, and the night shift who knew when a radius was wrong by the way it offended their wrists. When the truck arrived here far from its birthplace, it carried that entire conversation within it, and the conversation made work feel lighter. Simplicity was policy, not accident. Wherever a part could be, stamped instead of cast without betraying strength. It was stamped. Wherever a curve could be straight without making a mechanic swear later, it was straight. Tolerance stacked in favor of assembly and repair. Fasteners were selected with the future in mind, one wrench size doing duty where 5 might have flattered a designer's vanity. The carburetor told a similar truth. It was not clever in the way that ruins a cold morning. It was honest in the way that saves one. The electricals wore insulation that forgave chafe. Routing chose kindness over elegance. If a loom had to cross a sharp edge, someone had bothered to dull the edge or pad the loom, and that decision made a world away prevented a small fire on a night when men needed warmth, not light. Underneath the parts lay paperwork that actually helped. Manuals were written by people who had touched tools. Diagrams matched reality closely enough that a tired corporal, tracing a wire with his finger, could find his error in the time between shells. Even packaging had been considered. Spares arrived in crates that could become shelves, lids that could become drip trays. Economies hidden from the parade ground blossomed at the repair bench. The economy of minutes saved began to feel like a new kind of fuel. Contrast taught the lesson sharper than praise ever could. There were vehicles in the yard whose pedigree made men admire them on first glance and avoid them on second thought. Precision had been used as a kind of poetry, tolerances so tight that dust became treason, finishes so fine that a dent felt like a slur. They were wonderful in the way a watch is wonderful. Best when coddled, magnificent indoors. This truck was wonderful in the way a shovel is wonderful. Best when dirty, indispensable outdoors. That philosophy, humble, stubborn, modular, made allies of strangers. A German wrench fit an American nut. A length of hose from a tractor forgave the missing original. A spring from a crate, labelled "nothing helpful" in 2 languages, consented to act like it had always belonged. The manufacturing mindset had made that possible long before the truck crossed any front line. The master mechanic, who judged factories by the way their products made him feel after midnight, found himself quietly grateful to people whose names he did not know. They had decided, in peacetime conference rooms and hurried wartime meetings, that complexity had to justify itself. Here, at the edge of a frozen rail yard where every minute stolen from repair fed a mile of movement, their decision paid in a currency that mattered. The truck worked because whole systems behind it had been built to make working likely. That is how simplicity wins, not by being smaller, but by being ready. It began as a rumor carried on the backs of patrols. In the winter, when the roads went glassy and the fields went iron, a little truck showed up at a field park with more nerve than sense, carrying a wounded man and a suggestion. Within a week, it had been made decent and sent on errands that multiplied the way errands do in warm-up runs, dispatches to a battery, a ferrying of wire reels out to the edge where telephones turn into shouted names. By the next month, there were 3 in the district, none with quite the same history, all wearing repairs that told stories in wire, weld, and carefully chosen thefts from scrap. An officer with a neat hand wrote their numbers into the margin of a ledger and added a note about their temperament. Willing, low maintenance, good on bad ground. The note was not official doctrine. It behaved like one. Spring turned the ditches mean. The trucks took to the lanes between fields, cutting diagonals where roads drowned. They hauled a light gun to a position no one had intended to fire from, and then hauled back a man who had discovered that shrapnel has a sense of humour. The workshop playbook evolved in those weeks. Intake, fluids, spark, shakedown, allocate. A crate in the profix. Corner became the cache for the little ones. Into it went a distributor with life left in it, a pulley that could be persuaded, a fan belt slightly too long for anything else and perfect here. Summer's dust replaced winter's ice, and the trucks learned to wear it without inhaling it. Mesh appeared over a grill. A strip of canvas found purpose as a stone guard for the rear window of the car they often followed. The liaison officer stopped asking politely. He began to count on them. That was the month a divisional note acknowledged, in language that pretended to be casual, that captured light trucks of this type had proven of use in roles requiring mobility off established roads. The sentence was longer on paper. The meaning was short. Keep them. Autumn's rain practiced its cruelty with ruts, and the tire pumps worked like metronomes. Drivers learned the discipline of air. Down for mud. Up for road. Don't be lazy about it. A man posted a sheet near the fuel drums with the starting ritual written in a hand that could be read by someone with numb fingers. They saved an hour a day that month by not reinventing the same lesson. By the next winter, it was no longer a curiosity. The trucks were passed to new crews with the same seriousness as radios. One had acquired a field-made bracket for a reel. Another had a bracket for a stretcher that worked better than the first try. The third had nothing clever at all, just a record of not failing. Their reputation had hardened into an expectation. A motor sergeant advised a younger man that when the road disappeared, you took the little one and 2 shovels. That is how a machine changes its category without anyone awarding it a ceremony. The calendar accumulates hours, and the hours make a case stronger than praise. Somewhere there is a photograph of 3 of them parked nose to nose with a light car, mud up to their sills. Men laughing in the space that opens when relief finds a shape. You can read a year in their panels, dents where defiance met reality, repairs where patience met skill, patches where gratitude found a place to sit. The timeline ends not with triumph but with continuity. They kept going until there were no more roads to need them. The logbook was tidy because the master mechanic was that kind of man, but the margins held the truth in a tone official entries never catch. Someone wrote, in a line that slants upward like a smile, says yes when others think first. Another hand added, asks for little, gives on demand. A third, more sardonic, scrawled, swears in one language, works in all. Those notes weren't poetry. They were field reports, disguised as affection. Drivers found names so quickly you would think the trucks had come with them. One was Little Mule because it carried loads that made the springs flatten and then forgive. One was Postman because it always brought something that mattered and left before anyone could delay it with gratitude. One was Hammer because the driver claimed it solved problems by being present. Names like that stick because they are simply true in the ways that make men talk less and do more. There were voices beyond the yard. A liaison officer kept a cigar tin stuffed with torn scraps of paper times, distances, small miracles that wouldn't fit in forms. On one, he wrote, "Made the East Farm in 20. Road gone, field worse, took the ditch, low range, no drama." On another, returned with wounded, stretcher firm, driver's hands steady, patient did not curse once. He showed the tin to the mechanic the day the first snow came down heavy and said, "This is why you get the pick of the captured pile." The mechanic pretended not to hear the compliment and accepted it. A radio man, who thought in circuits and therefore had little patience for myth, told it cleanly. "It starts when I ask, and that means messages turn into action instead of apologies." An artillery observer, who had learned to measure minutes in lives, said, "It does not promise speed, it promises arrival, and arrival is what aim requires." A medic, rubbing cold out of her wrists between runs, murmured, "It rides kindly enough to make my work possible." That was the highest praise any machine ever got in that war. Some judgments were quieter. A sentry on the road out of town learned to tell its silhouette at a distance and lowered his rifle a few seconds sooner. A cook liked that flour sacks stacked well in the back without argument. Hot soup arrived at a corner of the line that had not expected it before dark. The blacksmith discovered he could straighten a bent steering arm with a heat he could count, because the steel didn't pretend to be special. A boy who had lied about his age to drive for headquarters confessed to the truck, on a night run back from a battery, that he was afraid. The truck answered by doing what it always did. It kept going. These are small things until they are added together. Then they become the texture of a reputation, and reputation is a shape you can lean on when the wind pushes. Men stopped arguing about whether the little truck deserved their faith because it kept paying the faith back with interest. The mechanic, copying times into the ledger while steam rose from the radiator like a ghost, learning to be gentle, understood that the greatest compliment a machine can be paid is not admiration. It is reliance. Here, among men who measure worth that way, the verdict was settled. In the end, the front moved on the way weather does suddenly, as if it had planned it, and slowly, as if nothing could truly change. The trucks moved with it until there were fewer places left, to teach the lesson they had carried from their first day in the yard. When the noise quieted and uniforms turned back into clothes, some of the little machines found new names painted on their hoods by men whose hands remembered. They became farm hands without complaint, carried timber from a copse that had escaped shelling, pulled a plough through the corner of a field too stony for anything delicate. They took police out to where roads fade into paths. They taught young mechanics that the shortest path to mastery is a design that lets you see what you're doing. But the legacy that mattered most lived back in the minds of people who decide how things will be built when the world is not on fire. They remembered that a machine can be simple and still be civilized, that serviceability is a virtue measured in hours given back to human tasks. The numbers that defined this truck became a kind of grammar for the next generation of light utility vehicles. The grammar was spare and generous. Build for access, design for tolerance. Choose interchangeability as a rule, and treat the man with the wrench as a customer, not an inconvenience. In the yard where this story began, winter unclenched its fist by degrees. Ice turned to water that ran off in black threads. The mechanic stood by the little truck as it warmed for what would be one of its last official errands under the old discipline. The radiator steamed in thin veils. The engine's idle carried that contented thrum that had become the sound of errands kept. The driver, older by months that felt like years, climbed in with the same respect, checked the choke out of habit, and settled the gear lever as though the two of them had negotiated this pact long ago. They drove out past the ditch that had taught humility and the slope that had taught balance, past the place where a stretcher had once lain steady while the earth tried to shake it. Snow still clung to the north side of the hedges. Mud remembered every tire that had passed. At the edge of the fields, the driver stopped and let the little truck sit with the engine ticking down. The mechanic looked across the land as if reading the margins of a logbook. He set his palm on the fender the way he had the first day, feeling heat and purpose. He had never been a man for speeches, especially not to metal, but he allowed himself a single sentence meant only for him and the truck. "You did what we asked, and you made it easier to ask." The driver let the clutch in, and the machine moved off, square-shouldered, unshowy, exactly itself. That is the image to keep. A small vehicle going about its work, in a world that has learned the value of such work. The name on its hood matters less than the promise it came to embody. A soldier's best friend is the tool that shows up, forgives, and carries on. They kept these not because they were trophies, or curiosities, or evidence of victory. They kept them because they were useful in the precise, unsentimental way that changes outcomes. That kind of usefulness is a legacy that outlives paint, and somewhere, on a cold morning that will come again, a hand will reach for a choke, a starter will answer, and a simple engine will choose once more to live.